The morning after that breaking point, I woke up before dawn, the kind of gray, heavy light that makes everything look washed out, and I made myself a promise, I wasn't going to drown quietly. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew I had to try something different, because sitting around feeling sorry for myself was killing me faster than the debt collectors ever could. I started applying for every job I could find, from administrative work to cashier positions, even though most of them paid less than what I'd earned 10 years earlier. Pride became a luxury I couldn't afford. I remember standing in line at a local cafe, filling out an application, when Daniel walked in, his dog tugging at the leash. He smiled, that easy kind of smile that didn't make me feel like a failure, and asked how I was doing. I don't know why, but I told him the truth, that I was scared, that I felt like my life was slipping through my fingers. He didn't try to fix it, he just said, "You've been through hell, Rachel, but you're still standing. That counts for something." It sounds simple, but those words stuck with me. Sometimes survival is the bravest thing you can do. I ended up getting a part-time job at a small diner off Route 42, waitressing like I hadn't done since I was 21. It was humbling work, aching feet, cranky customers, the smell of grease clinging to my hair, but the paycheck, small as it was, felt like a lifeline. I'd come home exhausted, hands raw from scrubbing tables, but when I saw Lily studying late at night, determined to build a future beyond our struggles, it gave me strength. She'd leave little notes for me on the fridge, "You're doing great, Mom," or "One day we'll laugh about all this," and I'd sit there reading them through tears, amazed at how love can grow even in the cracks of despair. But life has a cruel sense of timing. Just as I started to think maybe things were turning around, I got a letter from the bank, foreclosure notice. The mortgage had fallen too far behind, and there was no saving it. I sat on the porch that night, holding that letter like it was an obituary, and Daniel found me there. I didn't even realize he lived just 2 streets over. He didn't say much, just sat next to me, handed me a thermos of coffee, and let me cry until there were no tears left. That night, I told him everything, about Evan, the scam, the debt, the shame. I expected pity, maybe judgment. Instead, he said softly, "You've been carrying too much alone. Let someone help you for once." I wanted to argue, to insist I didn't need saving, but I was too tired to pretend. Over the next few weeks, he became this quiet constant in my life. He'd fix things around the apartment, bring over leftovers, make me laugh when I didn't think I could anymore. I told myself not to get attached, that I wasn't ready for anything, but there was something about his steadiness that made me start to breathe again. Still, reality was relentless. The foreclosure went through, and I had 60 days to vacate. I managed to find a small 2-bedroom rental in a rougher part of town, barely within budget, but it was something. Moving was humiliating, watching strangers carry boxes of a life that once felt whole. Lily tried to stay positive, calling it our fresh start, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She started working part-time at a grocery store to help with bills, and that broke me more than I expected. I wanted her to have a carefree youth, not carry her mother's burdens. Around that time, Evan reached out for the first time in months. He said Tanya had left him, that he was sorry for everything, and asked if we could talk. Part of me wanted to scream, another part wanted to know why he chose her, why he broke us. We met at a diner, and he looked smaller somehow, older. He apologized, and maybe he meant it, but it didn't matter anymore. The love I'd spent 20 years building had withered under neglect and betrayal. I told him I forgave him, not for him, but for me. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about letting someone off the hook, it's about setting yourself free from the chain that keeps dragging you back. After that, something shifted inside me. I started taking small steps to rebuild my credit, made a plan to tackle the debt little by little. I found a nonprofit that helped victims of online scams, and they guided me through the process of disputing fraudulent charges. It didn't erase everything, but it helped. Around that time, Daniel encouraged me to apply for a job at a local insurance startup. I laughed when he suggested it. Who would want a 45-year-old with a patchy employment record and a mountain of personal baggage? But he helped me rewrite my resume, reminded me of all the experience I'd earned, not just in offices but in life. I interviewed with the owner, a young woman named Jenna, who said she admired my resilience. A week later, I got the offer, part-time at first, but steady, with a chance to grow. I cried in the parking lot, ugly, snotty tears of relief and disbelief. For the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe I wasn't cursed, like maybe the universe hadn't forgotten me after all. Things didn't magically get easy after that. The debt still loomed, the nights were still long, but the weight on my chest began to ease. Daniel and I grew closer, slowly, carefully. He'd lost his wife to cancer years earlier, and I think we both understood grief in different forms. We'd sit on his porch sometimes, talking about nothing and everything, and one evening, as the sun set over the rooftops, he took my hand. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet and warm, and for once I didn't pull away. I don't know if it was love yet, but it was something real, something I thought I'd lost forever. When Lily graduated high school, I watched her walk across that stage, her eyes bright with hope, and I realized that despite everything, I'd done one thing right, I'd raised a fighter. After the ceremony, she hugged me and whispered, "We made it, Mom." And maybe we hadn't fully made it, not yet, but for the first time in years, I believed we could. Hope, I learned, isn't a sudden burst of light, it's the tiny flame you guard with trembling hands through the darkest storms. And somehow, against all odds, mine was still burning. If you told me even a year earlier that I'd find myself laughing again, really laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in your stomach, I would have called you crazy. Yet there I was, on a random Saturday afternoon, standing in Daniel's small backyard while his golden retriever, Max, stole a sandwich straight off the picnic table, and we both doubled over, helpless. It wasn't a big moment, no grand gesture, no cinematic music, but it felt like a turning point. For the first time in so long, my laughter didn't feel guilty. I'd spent years believing I wasn't allowed to feel joy until my life was fixed, but maybe joy wasn't the reward at the end, maybe it was the rope that helped you climb out of the pit. My job at Jenna's startup slowly became more than just a paycheck, it became purpose. The office was small, a handful of desks, coffee that always tasted slightly burnt, and a group of young analysts who spoke in a language of ambition I hadn't heard in years. They reminded me what hope sounded like. Jenna, barely 30, ran the place with this fearless optimism, and one day she asked me to mentor some of the newer hires. "You've got life experience they don't teach in business school," she said. I smiled but didn't tell her that most of that experience came from failure. Still, standing in front of those kids, guiding them through the mess of insurance claims and human mistakes, I realized I still had value. It was like remembering an old song you used to love but had forgotten the words to. Meanwhile, Daniel's presence in my life grew steadier, and I started spending weekends at his place, a modest craftsman-style house with creaky floors and a garden he tended like it was therapy. Lily adored him too, though she liked to tease me mercilessly, calling him Mom's mystery man. I'd blush and tell her to mind her own business, but secretly, her approval meant everything. She was 19 now, juggling community college and her part-time job, and she carried herself with a confidence that sometimes took my breath away. She was becoming everything I'd hoped she could be, resilient, kind, and unafraid to chase her dreams. Of course, life wasn't suddenly easy. Money was still tight, and the ghosts of my past mistakes followed me like shadows. Collection agencies don't stop calling just because you found hope again. But I learned to handle it differently. I set boundaries, made payment plans, refused to drown in shame. Daniel helped me draft a budget one evening at his kitchen table, spreading receipts like battle plans. He didn't judge, he just said, "Every dollar you pay back is a brick in the road out of this." That night, as I drove home, I cried, Not from sadness, but from gratitude. It's strange how kindness can break you open in the best way. Then, just as I started to believe I could truly rebuild, tragedy brushed past us again. Daniel had a heart attack, mild, thank God, but terrifying. I found out when he didn't answer my call one evening and his neighbor phoned me from the hospital. I remember the sterile smell of antiseptic, the rhythmic beep of machines, the way his hand looked pale against the white sheets. I sat beside him, gripping his fingers, whispering prayers I hadn't spoken in years. When he finally opened his eyes and smiled that tired, crooked smile, I felt something shift inside me, an overwhelming realization that love isn't about grand promises but about showing up when it matters most. After he recovered, we talked seriously about the future. He asked if I'd consider moving in, said he didn't want to waste whatever time life still had to offer us apart. I hesitated, not because I didn't love him, but because I was scared. I'd built so much of my identity around surviving alone that the idea of leaning on someone again felt dangerous. But he just looked at me and said, "Rachel, surviving isn't the same as living." That night, I packed a box. Not everything, just enough to symbolize a beginning. When Lily came by the next day, I told her, expecting resistance, but she hugged me and said, "You deserve to be happy, Mom." I'd forgotten how simple that truth could sound. The move was chaotic, boxes labeled half wrong, memories resurfacing as I decided what to keep. Daniel's house quickly became our home, a blend of his old-fashioned furniture and my mismatched thrift store finds. Max claimed the couch, of course. We planted marigolds and tomatoes in the backyard that spring, and for the first time in years, I found myself humming while doing dishes. There were still moments of fear. What if it all fell apart again? What if happiness was temporary? But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the woman I used to be, crying over unpaid bills, clutching a foreclosure notice, convinced she'd lost everything. That woman had survived. That meant this new version of me could do more than survive. She could live, love, rebuild. Settling into Daniel's house felt, at first, like walking into someone else's dream. Everything had its place: the framed photos of his late wife, the worn flannel blanket on the couch, the coffee mugs that didn't match but somehow belonged together, and I worried I'd always feel like a guest. But Daniel, in his quiet way, made space for me without ever making me ask. He cleared a drawer for my things, built a shelf in the hallway just for my books, and started leaving little notes in my lunch bag, scribbled in that messy handwriting of his, *, you've got this. Proud of you, *. It wasn't grand, but it was real, and that mattered more than anything. My job at the startup became steadier too. Jenna eventually promoted me to full-time, and for the first time in years, I could look at my paycheck without anxiety clawing at my stomach. I even managed to pay off one of my smaller credit cards, and that small victory felt like climbing a mountain. Still, some nights I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding with the old fear that everything could vanish again. Trauma, I've learned, doesn't disappear. It just quiets down until something reminds it to scream again. Around that time, Lily started dating a young man named Marcus, a kind soul with a mechanic's hands and a poet's heart. He treated her with respect, always called me ma'am, and though part of me wanted to guard her from every possible heartbreak, I could see in her eyes that this was something good. Watching her grow into her own woman filled me with a pride I hadn't known how to feel for myself. One weekend, she brought Marcus over for dinner. Daniel grilled chicken, I made potato salad, and the four of us sat outside under string lights, laughter drifting into the soft summer air. For the first time, I thought, maybe this is what peace feels like. But just as I began to settle into the rhythm of this new life, a letter came that threatened to unravel it all. It was from a debt collection agency I hadn't heard from in years. Apparently, one of the fraudulent charges from the scam had been resold to another company, and now they were threatening legal action unless I paid nearly $9,000. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read it, that old panic rising like a tide. My first instinct was to hide it from Daniel, to shoulder it alone as I'd always done. But when he found me sitting at the kitchen table, the letter clenched in my hand, he just said, "Let me see." He read it carefully, then looked at me with calm steadiness. "We'll deal with this," he said simply. The "we" hit me like a lifeline. Together, we contacted a consumer attorney, and after weeks of back and forth, I managed to prove the debt wasn't legally valid. When the letter came confirming the case was closed, I sobbed in Daniel's arms. Not because of the money, but because I'd finally learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was strength. Around that same time, Evan resurfaced again, this time not with apologies, but with news. He'd lost his job and was struggling. He called asking if I could lend him a little money, just until he got back on his feet. Old me might have said yes out of guilt or habit, but I'd changed. I told him calmly that I couldn't, that my responsibility was to myself and our daughter now. He sighed, muttered something about how cold I'd become, and hung up. For a moment, his words stung. Then I realized, he didn't know this version of me. He only knew the woman who'd once begged him to stay. That night, I sat in the garden under the stars, and for the first time, I felt a clean kind of freedom, the kind that comes not from revenge or resentment, but from simply letting go. Work grew busier, and Jenna started trusting me with more responsibility. One afternoon, she called me into her office and said, "Rachel, we're opening a new branch, and I want you to run operations there." I stared at her, stunned. Me, the woman who'd once been scammed, bankrupt, broken. She smiled and said, "You've lived through more than most people ever will. That's the kind of resilience I want leading this team." When I got home and told Daniel, he lifted me off the ground, spinning me around until Max barked in protest. Lily cried happy tears when she heard, and that night, we celebrated with takeout and cheap champagne that somehow tasted like victory. Still, life had one more test waiting. A few months later, Daniel's health began to falter again, nothing catastrophic, just reminders that time doesn't stop for anyone. Doctor visits, medications, fatigue. I became his caretaker in small ways, reminding him to rest, sitting with him through appointments, but he hated feeling like a burden. One evening, he said, "Rachel, if something ever happens to me, I need to know you'll keep living. Don't go back to surviving." I promised him I would, even though the thought made my chest ache. That winter, he had a second heart attack, and this time, he didn't make it. He died in his sleep, quietly, peacefully, with Max curled at his feet. I found him in the morning, his hand resting on the blanket as if he'd just drifted off mid-thought. The grief was different this time, not the tearing apart kind, but a deep, still sorrow that came with love and gratitude. I arranged a small memorial, and people came from all over, neighbors, co-workers, even Lily's friends who'd called him Mr. D. After everyone left, I sat in the garden we'd planted together, the marigolds still blooming despite the cold, and whispered, "Thank you." Losing him hurt, but I didn't crumble. I'd learned how to hold pain without letting it consume me. Over time, I poured my energy into work, into helping Lily and Marcus move into their first apartment, into volunteering at a local shelter for women who'd been scammed or abandoned like I once was. I shared my story there, not as a victim, but as proof that survival could bloom into something stronger. And slowly, the ache turned into something softer, a reminder, not a wound. Sometimes, late at night, I still talked to Daniel, telling him about my day, about how the tomatoes came in early or how Max stole my slippers again. I imagine him smiling somewhere, telling me he's proud. I'm 48 now. The debts are gone, the fear has quieted, and while I'm not rich in the way I once dreamed, I'm rich in something far more lasting, peace. When I think back to the woman who once sat in a dark apartment surrounded by bills and broken trust, I wish I could tell her this, that she wasn't finished, that her story wasn't over, that life had beauty waiting even after the worst storms. And maybe that's why I'm telling it now. Because somewhere out there, another woman is staring at an overdue notice, or an empty side of the bed, or a rejection email, thinking it's the end. But it isn't. It's just the beginning of the version of herself who will rise. I did. It's strange how, after loss, life insists on continuing, as if the world doesn't realize you're not ready yet. The morning after Daniel's funeral, sunlight still filtered through the curtains, cars still honked outside, and the mail still came. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at a half-empty mug of coffee, feeling that dull, hollow ache that comes when grief and disbelief blur together. For a while, I moved through my days like a ghost, feeding Max, going to work, paying bills, but everything felt muted. Still, there was something inside me that refused to sink. Maybe it was the years of hardship that had toughened me, or maybe it was Daniel's voice echoing in my memory, don't go back to surviving, I held on to that like a mantra. One weekend, as I was cleaning out his study, I found a folder labeled Future Projects. Inside were sketches for a community garden he'd wanted to start, a place where neighbors could plant vegetables, share food, and talk. The idea hit me like sunlight through clouds. That's what he'd always believed in: growth, connection, giving back. So, I decided to make it happen. It started small, a patch of land behind the local library that had been neglected for years. I talked to the city council, filled out forms, wrote emails, begged for donations. Jenna helped me spread the word through her company, and before long, volunteers began showing up: retirees, kids, single moms, even people from my support group at the shelter. We pulled weeds, tilled soil, and painted a weathered sign that read "The Hope Garden." Every time I looked at it, I thought of Daniel, his hands in the dirt, his quiet smile. That garden became more than a project, it became a piece of healing stitched into the heart of our town. I met so many women there, faces weary but determined, stories that mirrored my own. One, named Teresa, had lost her savings to a fake loan company. Another, Sharon, had left an abusive marriage with nothing but her 2 kids and a suitcase. We planted more than seeds together, we planted pieces of ourselves we thought were dead. Watching them grow, seeing joy spark in eyes that had once held only fear, reminded me that recovery doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when someone looks at you and says, "Me too." My relationship with Lily deepened during that time too. She and Marcus married in a small ceremony at the community hall, simple, full of laughter and homemade food. When she asked me to walk her down the aisle, I almost broke down. Standing there, holding her arm, I thought of every night I'd lain awake wondering if I was failing her, if she'd grow up resenting me for all the instability. But as she looked at me and whispered, "I love you, Mom," I knew I'd done something right. After the wedding, Marcus helped me expand the garden, adding benches and a small fountain in Daniel's memory. Life moved in gentle waves. I kept working at the insurance firm, eventually transitioning into a training and outreach role, helping people understand financial scams and fraud prevention. It felt poetic somehow, turning my worst mistake into something that could protect others. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a women's conference downtown. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I felt that familiar flicker of nerves. But then I remembered the woman I'd been, the one sitting in the dark, afraid to answer her phone, and I spoke to her instead. I told them the truth, that heartbreak can break you open in ways that let the light in, that debt and shame don't define worth, that starting over at 45 isn't failure, it's proof you're still alive. When I finished, the applause felt less like celebration and more like connection, as if each clap was saying, "I understand." Afterward, a woman in her 50s came up to me, tears in her eyes, and said, "You just told my story." I hugged her and thought, maybe that's why I went through it all, to hand someone else a map out of the dark. Years have passed since then. I'm 50 now, and while my face has more lines, they feel earned, like the rings in a tree trunk telling the story of every storm it survived. I still live in Daniel's house, our house, with Max, who's slower now but still insists on stealing socks whenever he can. The garden thrives every summer, bursting with color, laughter, and community. Kids run through rows of sunflowers, old friends share tomatoes and stories. Sometimes I sit on the bench by the fountain and close my eyes, imagining Daniel's hand in mine. I don't cry anymore, not really. The grief has softened into something peaceful, like a melody that never quite fades but no longer hurts to hear. Lily visits often, bringing Marcus and their baby boy, Evan named after her father. When she told me what she planned to name him, I hesitated for just a second, memories flickering, but then I realized it was her way of rewriting the name with love instead of pain. Watching her rock that little boy to sleep, I see hope blooming again, in a new generation. Financially, I'm stable now. Not wealthy, but comfortable. I still keep a small, emergency envelope of cash hidden in the kitchen drawer, a habit I doubt I'll ever lose, but I don't live in fear anymore. The past taught me caution, but it also taught me courage. Some evenings, when the sun dips low and the sky turns gold, I walk through the neighborhood, greeting faces that once were strangers but now feel like family. I think about how life rarely unfolds the way we plan, and yet somehow, it still manages to bring us exactly where we need to be. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that pain can be both destroyer and teacher. It stripped me bare, forced me to see who I was without titles, without marriage, without money, and in that emptiness, I found something stronger, myself. I used to believe my story was one of loss, but now I see it's one of rediscovery. Because every debt I paid, every tear I shed, every moment I thought I couldn't go on, they all brought me here, to this quiet kind of happiness that doesn't shout but hums softly beneath the surface of everyday life. Sometimes I stand in the garden at dusk, dirt on my hands, air thick with the scent of basil and rain, and I whisper to the sky, I made it. Not because I have everything, but because I finally understand I am enough. Sometimes I think about the word after. It used to scare me, the idea of what comes after love, after loss, after everything you thought defined you disappears. But now, after feels like a place I live comfortably in, a gentle rhythm instead of a void. 5 years have passed since Daniel's death, and though time has softened the edges of grief, it hasn't erased him. He lingers in the small things, the hum of the porch light he always meant to fix, the dog-eared gardening book on the shelf, the way the marigolds still bloom earlier than they should. I talk to him in my head sometimes, updating him on Lily's life, on the new people who've joined the Hope Garden, on the little victories that fill my days. I think he'd like how things turned out. The garden has grown into something far bigger than I ever imagined. What began as a few raised beds has become a full-fledged community program with volunteers from all over the city. We now host workshops on budgeting, job readiness, and fraud awareness. Every season, we dedicate one corner to something symbolic, a memory patch, where survivors of scams, abuse, or loss can plant something in honor of what they've overcome. The first time I saw Teresa kneel beside her row of lavender, tears in her eyes, whispering a prayer for her late husband, I understood what healing looks like in its quietest form. Healing isn't loud or perfect, it's showing up, even when your hands still shake. Professionally, I've built something I'm proud of too. Jenna promoted me again, this time to Director of Community Outreach, and while the title still makes me laugh, it comes with purpose that feels bigger than any salary ever could. I travel around Ohio now, speaking to groups about financial resilience and the emotional toll of scams. People often ask how I managed to move past the shame, and I tell them the truth. I didn't move past it, I grew around it, like roots pushing through concrete. I tell them that pain is not permanent residency, it's a visitor, and if you face it long enough, eventually it leaves, taking its lessons with it. On quiet evenings, I sit on the porch with Max at my feet and a glass of sweet tea in my hand, listening to the distant hum of cicadas. The neighborhood kids ride their bikes past, shouting goodnight, and sometimes I catch glimpses of Lily's family walking home from the park. Little Evan, now 4 years old, runs ahead, his laughter echoing in the warm air. When he spots me, he always yells, "Grandma Rach," before barreling into my arms. I never thought I'd like that nickname, but now it feels like music. I spoil him shamelessly, of course, but more than anything, I try to teach him small lessons about kindness, patience, and wonder, the things that kept me alive when everything else fell apart. I tell him stories about the garden and about Daniel, and though he's too young to understand, one day he will. One spring afternoon, as I was pruning tomato plants, a young woman approached me hesitantly. She said her name was Nina, that she'd found my story online after attending one of my workshops. She was 24, recently scammed out of her savings by a fake online loan company. Her voice trembled as she spoke, shame written all over her face, and I saw my younger self in her, desperate, humiliated, lost. I invited her to join our next planting day. She came, quiet at first, then slowly opened up. A few months later, she told me she'd found a new job, repaired her credit, and even started volunteering to teach others how to spot fraud. Watching her transformation felt like seeing my own story rewritten with hope. That's the thing about sharing pain, it multiplies healing. The more I give, the lighter it becomes. And yet, even now, there are moments when the past whispers. When the bills come due or when I pass the old house where Evan and I used to live, I feel a flicker of the old ache. But instead of drowning in it, I let it remind me how far I've come. Forgiveness has become a daily practice, not just toward others but toward myself, for the mistakes, the naivety, the years I spent apologizing for existing. I'm learning that being gentle with yourself is its own form of revolution. Last year, I finally paid off the last of my debt. I stood in the bank parking lot holding that final confirmation letter and cried, not because of the money, but because I'd closed a chapter that once defined me. I celebrated by taking a small trip alone, my first ever solo vacation, to a cabin by Lake Erie. The silence there was different from the silence of my darker days, it was full instead of empty. I walked the shore, let the cold water wash over my feet, and felt something like rebirth. I thought about writing a book someday, maybe calling it Still Standing. Not for fame or profit, but to tell the story of women like me who start over at midlife and build something beautiful from the wreckage. Maybe I will. Or maybe it's enough to live the story instead of writing it. Lily keeps encouraging me, saying, "Mom, people need to hear you." I tell her they already do. Every time we plant, every time someone new joins the garden, every time I choose peace over fear. The other night, I found an old photo of myself at 35, back when Evan and I were still married, before the lies and the losses. I stared at that woman's face for a long time. She looked so sure, so naive, so unaware of what life was about to demand from her. I don't pity her anymore. I thank her. She got me here. She made the hard choices, she walked through the fire, and even when she thought she'd broken beyond repair, she kept going. That's something I'll never forget. These days, my joy is quieter but deeper. It's in the smell of basil on my hands, the laughter of my grandson, the hum of life still going even after everything. I no longer crave the kind of happiness that looks perfect from the outside. I want the kind that feels like exhaling after years of holding my breath. And I have it now. Sometimes, when twilight settles and the world goes soft, I sit on the garden bench beside Daniel's fountain and close my eyes. The water trickles steadily, the earth smells alive, and I whisper, I'm okay. Because I am. Because despite every heartbreak, every debt, every mistake, I found my way back to myself. And that, more than anything, is what peace really is.